Good afternoon and welcome to today's presentation. A leer, a pat, a joke, a gesture, an innuendo, a kiss. Are you prepared to be the next social media blitz, identified on MeToo, or a headline in the newspaper? The information presented by the expert is not to be used as legal advice and does not indicate a working relationship with the expert. All materials obtained from this presentation are merely for educational purposes and should not be used in a court of law sans the expert's consent, i.e. a business relationship where she or he is hired for your particular case. On today's webinar, Susan will discuss difference between flirting and sexual harassment, effective elements in your organization's prevention strategy, review complaint procedures that must be incorporated into your harassment policy, critical elements of sexual harassment training, identify the elements of sexual harassment on the target, the work unit, and organization, retaliation, steps to take if you are targeted by a sexual harasser, management's legal and ethical responsibility in the prevention and intervention of sexual harassment, and step 2, if an employee complains about an old incident of sexual harassment. To give you a little background about our presenter, Dr. Susan Strauss is a national and international speaker, trainer, and consultant. Her specialty areas include education and workplace harassment, discrimination and bullying, organization development, and management leadership development. Susan conducts bullying and harassment investigations, works as an expert witness for education and workplace harassment and bullying lawsuits. She also coaches those managers and employees that need assistance in stopping the harassing or bullying behavior. Attendees require passcode. The word for today is harassment. During the Q&A session, we ask that you enter this passcode into the Q&A widget for CLE reporting purposes. The Q&A is located to the left of your screen. Please remember that if you're applying for CLE credit, you must log onto your computer as yourself and stay for the full 90 minutes. You're also required to complete the survey at the end of the program. Please note that CLE credit cannot be given to those watching together on a single computer. Tomorrow morning, we will send out an email with a link to the archive recording of the webinar. The slides can be downloaded from the resource list as the widget at the bottom of your screen. Thank you all for attending today. And Susan, the presentation is now turned over to you.
Well, thank you, and welcome everybody. So glad that you joined all of us today. I just want to give you a heads up that I am struggling with a tad of a hoarse voice. So periodically I will be taking a drink of water. I just don't want you to think that when there's a pause that you've been disconnected. So with that, let's go forward. There's a little bit of a bio if you want more information. So let's talk about the objectives for today's webinar. You know, with everything that's been going on in the media, there is a fair amount of confusion about what really constitutes sexual harassment. And how do you know, if we look at this first objective, whether you are flirting or sexually harassing somebody? What is illegal harassment versus psychological harassment? And what about bullying versus sexual harassment? Is there a nexus between the two? So that's going to be the first objective. Second objective is we'll look at some of the elements that should be included in your prevention policy. Now, I know some of you work in law firms and others of you are solo practitioners, and you might be thinking more in terms of how you can assist your clients. Whatever the case, I'm hoping that all of this will be helpful for you. We'll look at the complaint procedures. You know, one of the things I discover in my expert witness work is that for some reason, when a complaint has made it all the way into the court proceedings and I am reviewing whatever documents exist, that HR does not follow their policy and their reporting procedure. It just isn't there, so it's an important element. We'll look at some of the critical elements of sexual harassment training. Some of this will be based on a recent 2016 EEOC study. We'll also look at the effects of sexual harassment on the target and the work unit and the organization. Good old retaliation, of course, raises its ugly head frequently when there's been complaints of retaliation? And what do you do if you are targeted by the sexual harasser? What steps can be taken? We'll also identify management's legal and ethical responsibilities in the prevention and intervention of sexual harassment. And then what do you do if an employee complains about an old incident of sexual harassment? And whatever old might be, basically, even if it is an old incident, say of a year or more, you still, if possible, need to conduct an investigation. Okay, so why are we here in the first place? Well, you're here because sexual harassment has raised its ugly head and brought attention to the fact that we have a problem in America's workplaces still. So this is something that is of importance to your clients and to your own law firm. We're here because it's a legal issue. We're also here because this is a financial issue. The financial issue deals with indirect costs, such as absenteeism, turnover, loss of productivity, but of course there's additional costs when you consider lawyers' fees, you consider paying expert witnesses, etc. And then finally, it's just good management practice. Anymore, if there are organizations, employers that are not conducting sexual harassment training, I think they're asking for trouble. And I would expand that to say the training needs to include harassment of all protected classes. There had been a case, a couple of years ago that I was reading about that when the jury found out that the employer had not conducted any sexual harassment training, particularly for managers, they in fact awarded the plaintiff an additional $1 million. So what we're also discovering is that while the Supreme Court has not come right out and said training is important for prevention, we are finding that juries are disclosing it in their decisions that training is important. Now, the newest statistics we have from the EEOC are from 2016. And you can see here that it was a little under 13,000 charges that went to the EEOC. Now, that was the largest number over the last 6 years. But keep in mind that that 13,000 does not include charges that went to any of the state's human rights or civil rights agencies. And that most people that are targeted by sexual harassment do not come forward and file formal charges. So the 13,000 plus is a low statistic. Now, the EEOC conducted their workplace harassment study in 2016, and look at this, 90% of harassment targets never reported or take formal action. Now, we've got to look at that because that tells us that employees are not trusting the culture. It also tells us that managers need to put on a different set of lenses when they are observing the behaviors occurring among their employees. They do not want to think of themselves as the workplace police, and sometimes they just find it easier to ignore some of those behaviors than to deal with them. Additionally, what I have found when I conduct training is they don't know how to deal with it. They don't necessarily recognize those more subtle, nuanced forms of harassment. Therefore, they don't intervene to prevent it from becoming severe and or pervasive. They need that kind of training as well. And all we've had to do is turn on the TV lately and hear about the various sexual harassing behaviors that have been ongoing for years and years. And what we're hearing about primarily is the sexual harassment from those that are politicians as well as those that are in the entertainment industry. But we've got to be cautious here because they are just the ones getting the notoriety. But sexual harassment, as you well know, occurs in all industries, and in all sized organizations. Fox News, of course, was well-versed when Ms. Carlson came forward to talk about the behavior, and they were paying over $50 million just in 1 year to settle their sexual harassment claims. I think one of the largest that I ever read about was, right around $300 million, if you can imagine. And this was a case that occurred in the operating room where there were several surgeons, cardiovascular surgeons, that had been sexually harassing a physician's assistant that had been ongoing for years. I'm sure that's being appealed, but it gives you an idea. At that point, that had been the largest settlement that had occurred regarding sexual harassment in the workplace. The MeToo movement has gained great notoriety, not only in the United States, but around the world. And what the MeToo movement is saying, whoops, we're missing a piece there. Let's see if we can get that. I don't know where that went. So we are seeing, I don't know, this has become, there we go. Let's go back one. I'm going to try this. Push to audience, that's not going to work either. Well, we've got one that's not wanting to go forward on the Me Too movement. But basically we're saying, hey, we want people to put their money where their mouth is, the Me Too movement is, and saying actions are louder than words. And by that, the Me Too movement is saying you've got to do more than just conduct training. You've got to look at your culture and what's going on with the culture. Now, I'm going to start with sort of a 101, okay? Because as attorneys, especially if you're in employment law, of course, this is going to be old hat to you. But those that are not in employment law, this might be just a little bit of a 101. So, back in 1980, we had this come out from the EEOC. A piece of trivia, by the way, that you may or may not know, is that during that time, Clarence Thomas was the head of the EEOC, and it is now Justice Thomas, as he is on the Supreme Court, and Anita Hill worked for him. So when you look at that, who was she going to complain to when you consider that they both worked for the EEOC? Now, when we look at this definition, we can see the ambiguity that encompasses it. What is a sexual advance? What is a sexual favor? What is conduct of a sexual nature? And of course, as more and more cases have gone to court, we've been able to fine-tune what we mean by this. Now, to bring you forward on this slide, because usually I have them animated, let's look at what is required in order for behavior to be a violation of the Civil Rights Act Title VII. So I'm going to draw your attention to the upper left corner of the slide where it says welcomeness. So the first thing that needs to be determined is the misconduct unwelcome? That seems easy enough, right? If it's welcomed, no big deal. If it's not welcomed, then we must ask, and if you go over to the right-hand side of the slide, we must ask, is the behavior severe and or pervasive enough that it interferes with an individual's ability to do their job and creates a hostile work environment? Now, when we think about that, we think about it from the perspective of reasonableness, the lower right-hand corner. So a reasonable person is the name of the standard, and that standard has sometimes been expanded to refer to a reasonable woman standard. That came about in 1992 when a judge was in the courtroom ruling that a reasonable person standard, which of course gets argued frequently in a variety of different professional journals, including law journals, what does it mean? But the judge said, hey, you know what, we really need to look at this beyond a reasonable person. The reasonable person standard is looking at it through the lens of a default male perspective. And primarily, back in 1992 and up to the present, most victims of harassment are women. Therefore, we need to examine some of the behavior from the perspective of a reasonable woman. I'll get to reasonable victim later. And of course, if we go to the lower left, it needs to be sexual and or gender-based. All right, so what do we mean by that? Let's look at it as a whole. The behavior needs to be unwelcomed. It needs to be severe and or pervasive enough that it would interfere with an individual's ability to do his or her job based on the standard of a reasonable person, reasonable woman. And what we're going to do today is look at this from the more traditional aspect of sexual harassment of a male to a female. Now, that said, men also are sexually harassed, obviously. They are sexually harassed by other men. They are sexually harassed by women. Women can also be sexually harassed by other women. But for ease of the webinar, I'm going to stick with the more stereotypical traditional viewpoint. Now, when we talk about the fact that the behavior needs to be severe and or pervasive to really interfere with an individual's ability to do her or his job, we're not talking about the inability to do their job for that day. We're saying, hey, this is really causing a problem. I don't want to come to work. I'm not productive. My quality of work has diminished. And based on a reasonable, we're going to say woman right now, and it has to be sexual and or gender-based. So what do we mean by gender-based? Gender-based is a term that is going to represent a nexus between bullying and sexual harassment. So let's say, for example, that we have Johnny, and Johnny is a, quote, bully, however you may define that, and Johnny only bullies the women that he works with. He does not, quote, bully the men. That might be argued then that Johnny is, in fact, guilty of a violation of Civil Rights Title VII, sex discrimination, but specifically gender-based sex discrimination. So Johnny is not doing anything that is overtly sexual, but he is targeting only women for his misconduct. That is what we can refer to as gender-based sexual harassment. Sexual harassment is your typically overt kinds of behaviors that we're going to be talking about as we progress through. Now, to show you what's going on here, let's say we've got Johnny who's telling dirty jokes in the staff room during a break. Susie does not like the dirty jokes, and he's only told them once or twice, and they've been working together for years. Number one, is it unwelcome? Well, yes, it is. Number two, Susie comes to you and complains. Is it the behavior of Johnny severe and or pervasive enough that it would interfere with Susie's ability to do her job, thereby creating a hostile work environment from the perspective of a reasonable woman, and was it sexual? Well, okay, it was unwelcome, but hey, severe and or pervasive to interfere with a reasonable woman's perspective? No way. It might interfere with Susie based on whatever her history is, but if we look at it objectively, it's not going to interfere with the reasonable woman. Now, you notice in the middle of the slide, I've got protected classes. And while today's webinar is only dealing with sexual harassment, these factors are also pertinent for harassment of all the other protected classes as well. Now, one of the things we'll be mentioning a little later on is something called intersectionality, where we have an intersect between the race and the gender of a target. Now, the other type of sexual harassment is quid pro quo, and you all know what that means. Now, in quid pro quo, one time if a supervisor is sexually harassing one of his direct reports by threatening that individual, that person would either be fired, would be demoted, or would not be hired, as an example, or conversely, would be promoted, would get a raise, and would be hired if, hey, sleep with me and the job is yours, have late night dinners with me and we'll get along just fine, date me and I won't fire you. You get the idea. One time, and there is absolute liability, that individual needs to be fired, and away we go because there's liability with one episode. Let's look at these in a little bit more detail. The question comes up with, what do we mean by severe? What is severity? Well, I've got them listed here on the screen for you, and they seem pretty self-explanatory. I'd like to go down to the middle one that says symbols of violence or hatred. Now, in this case, the symbols of violence or hatred, because we're dealing with sexual harassment, have to be based on violence or hatred towards men or towards women. Now, you'll notice I have use of the N-word. That, of course, would include racial harassment, but the N-word by a couple of federal judges last fall indicated that the use of the N-word once was enough to give probable cause for a case to go forward. Now, I'm using the N-word here because when we talk about intersectionality, that might be pertinent. Animal imagery, and you might go, what do you mean? Well, animal imagery is sometimes used in a sexually derogatory way, particularly towards women. And then we've got the last item on the list, which is talking about the quid pro quo, which has absolute liability. Now let's look at pervasive. When we identify pervasive, it deals with the frequency of behavior. And we have to look at it from the cumulative effect, not an individual act. And it will depend on specific facts. I wish I could give you a magic number as to what pervasive means. Part of that will be up to an individual investigator within the company. Part of it might be based on you all as attorneys, and if it goes to court, it's going to be based on a jury. But the frequency can play a couple of, or display itself in a couple of ways. One, we've got Johnny, all right? He's been telling dirty jokes, and we find that he's not only telling them to his staff during the noon hour, but he is also going into break rooms with different departments and telling his favorite jokes. He has then become, perhaps, pervasive in that his behavior is pervasive throughout the organization. Another way that might be pervasive is that he is targeting just one woman in particular and is consistently telling the dirty jokes to her. So those would be examples of pervasive. Now, depending on specific facts, I mean, let's face it, we've all heard and probably told a couple of dirty jokes ourselves, right? Some of them are dirty, but you know what? They're kind of cute, too. And they're not some of these really raunchy, crude things. So when we talk about depending on the specific facts, and now I'm only using an example of jokes, that would be something we might look at. Was it a really crude, raunchy type of joke, or was it one of these, more benign types? Anyway, you get the idea. The other thing that's important to examine as we look at a reasonable person/woman/victim role is the idea of subjective versus objective. So when we talk about a subjective viewpoint, we're looking at it from the perspective of the target. Now, Susie may have a particularly sensitive idea about what constitutes really inappropriate sexual behavior in the workplace. And hearing one or two quote-unquote dirty jokes to her is terrible. But what the law will look at is this reasonable based on any other reasonable person or reasonable woman? That is the objective perspective. Hey, come on now. Susie might be feeling that this is pretty bad from her point of view, but would any other reasonable woman or reasonable person feel that way? And I get asked this all the time when I do training from people, well, what's reasonable anyway? And isn't that just the $64 million question? And again, this will be based on the circumstances and the relationship of the individual. So when we think about a hostile work environment, this is another question that comes up. What do we mean by that anyway? On the slide, you will see the number of bullet points, and these bullet points reflect some of the issues that will be examined as to the determination of whether it is or is not a hostile work environment. And this will be done by the investigator. Hopefully, what I see is they don't always do this. It would be something that the attorneys would look at as well as the jury. So this gives you an idea of what we would examine to be a hostile work environment. So sexual harassment, and this is an important element, does not, and we're going to start again, this is not animated, so I'll try to talk you through it. It does not need to be directed at a particular worker. So, for example, one case that came up years ago was the Jacksonville shipyard case. This was really going back in time. And in this case, the men that worked at the shipyard had put pornographic pictures up in the lunchroom and the break room. Now, those pornographic pictures didn't have any woman's name on it. It wasn't directed towards any particular individual, but every woman that went in there, and quite frankly, any man as well, who was offended by it, felt sexually harassed. So did the court, even though the pornography was not directed at a certain worker. I was in a school the other day doing some training. This was a high school to teachers, etc. And one of the teachers had shared that there was a group of high school boys during lunch. They all had their phones out, and they were all, there was about 6 of them, watching pornography on their phones during school. Now, she was forced to see it because she was supervising. That's another example. It was not directed towards her. But you may also have an individual harasser who may be making sexual comments, sexual jokes, sexual gestures, sexual touching towards an individual coworker, and everybody else sees it because they work together. That the individual witnesses may also be sexually harassed. So other workers, if we're following the arrows, who see or hear about the sexual misconduct could potentially be sexually harassed as well. The context would need to be considered as we're going through. And we also now will look on the bottom when we talk about gender-based epithets. So derogatory comments that are being made regarding men or regarding women, and potentially regarding the LGBT population, which we'll talk about later. Using code words such as, oh, you people, which is referring to men or women. And then the example of pornography. So Title VII, though, is very clear in stating that it is not a civility code, and that, sometimes little harmless pranks occur. And it's interesting because on the slide it says run-of-the-mill boorish, juvenile, or annoying behavior. However, I will tell you to be careful with that. I got a call from an industry about a month ago, and they are the professional association for this industry. And they said, we've got a huge problem in our industry. It's comprised primarily of men, and they engage in this kind of behavior, but it has elevated to the point that they refer to it as behavior you'd see in a fraternity house, and it's causing problems. So as with most things, there is a continuum. So Title VII then must deal with behaviors that are severe or pervasive and are physically threatening or humiliating and interfere with one's work performance. One of the questions that comes up is, what standard do we use anyway in determining whether or not the sexual misconduct that's been reported is in fact a violation of Title VII. So I find in my work as an expert witness that most folks do not understand the value of this standard. We look at a preponderance of evidence or beyond a reasonable doubt. Civil law generally uses a preponderance of evidence, and criminal law uses beyond a reasonable doubt. And you may ask, well, okay, for those of you that may not deal with civil law, what do we really mean by a preponderance of evidence? Well, we're really talking about saying, well, more likely than not, the evidence suggests that this misconduct either did or did not happen. And we will say 51% of the evidence suggests that it did or did not. Now, sometimes it's hard to quantify by saying 51% of the evidence when what you're really doing is qualitative type of an investigation. But to the best you can, you look at it from more likely than not. Now, if any of you are listening in today and you are dealing with education, our Director of Education in the U.S. has now talked about the fact that beyond a reasonable doubt can be used in the educational setting, and that has met with quite a bit of discussion and indication that she is giving more credence to those that are being accused than those that are doing the accusing. So we also have to think in terms of harassment. Is there psychological harassment versus illegal harassment? And excuse me, I gotta take a drink. So when we talk about Johnny telling the dirty jokes and Susie not liking them, that would be an example of psychological harassment. That would be an example of a violation of one's policy, but it would not be illegal harassment. And I think what we're hearing in the media today is a mixture of the two. We've got some women that are coming forward indicating that so-and-so kissed them without their permission, and therefore they were sexually harassed. From the layperson's perspective, that might very well be true. It might be true based on a employer sexual harassment policy, but it certainly would not constitute a violation of Title VII of the Civil Rights. So people may frequently feel as though they have been psychologically harassed, and rightly so, and it is a violation of the employer's policy, yet it would not be illegal. And that's where we are finding much of the confusion. So what we need to be aware of for our own law firms, as well as for those that you might be providing counsel for, is that you need to intervene when the behavior is inappropriate. If it is inappropriate, it is more than likely against policy, and you want to intervene at that point to prevent it from becoming illegal. So the prevention portion, and the Supreme Court says, remember, you've got to prevent sexual harassment from occurring as well as intervening. So when you see that there is somebody telling dirty jokes, for example, or making some sexual innuendo, you want to nip that in the bud just as soon as you can, because you don't want it to escalate to the point of being illegal harassment. Now, in 1998, the Supreme Court heard the case of Faragher versus City of Boca Raton, and they came up with some impactful statements to organizations. This particular case was involving a supervisor, and the Supreme Court stated that organizations are now responsible for sexual harassment by a supervisor, even if they are not aware. They also indicated that there will be an increase in liability to the employer if there is any tangible action. And we'll talk specifically about retaliation and tangible action, because right now we're getting more into the quid pro quo. And I will tell you, by the way, that retaliation complaints to the EEOC have escalated for the fourth year in a row. In 2016, they were up to 46% of complaints to the EEOC were for retaliation. The Supreme Court indicated then that employers are responsible for both preventing and correcting incidents of sexual harassment. But they also said that if, in fact, a supervisor is sexually harassing a direct report, that employee, the direct report, for the first time had some responsibility. And their responsibility was, in essence, to utilize whatever measures existed by their employer to deal with the harassment. So basically, to report it, because they were told by the Supreme Court's ruling that you must follow your policy and procedure and report the supervisor's misconduct to either another supervisor or HR. It was also in 1998 through a different lawsuit, which was Ontel versus Sundowner, which I'll mention later, that same-sex harassment was relevant, and that sexual harassment did not have to be based on sexual attraction, that it was, in fact, based on power as well. Now, this is what Faragher versus City of Boca Raton, the defense, when they talked about the prevention. Obviously, policy is a huge issue, and including sexual harassment, for the policy is important. Just as a side, what I see is that organizations put more credence on sexual harassment than they do regarding harassment of the other protected classes. They need to give credence to all of them, and I'm not seeing that equally. So the policy needs to be reviewed. It needs to stay current with case law. And when you look at the policy and you look at reviewing it, it's not enough to just have legal counsel take a look at it. You should get input from employees. Hey, when you read this policy, number one, does it make sense? Or is all the legalese, which frequently is part of the policy, confusing? So are those people that are the employees going to be able to understand what it's saying? Also regarding policy, do you have it translated into other languages that are prominent in the organization? Be sure that you do so. Now, what about training? I'm going to get into training more as we progress through the webinar, but certainly training will be important. And I will also add with this piece, are you doing training using interpreters? So if you are training a group that does not have fluidity of the English language, make sure that you either conduct the training with somebody who does, or that you use an interpreter that will interpret what the trainer is saying. You also need to have prompt remedial action. Now, that's going to be impossible if you have not done a prompt investigation. But you know, here's the other deal. What I have discovered is, not only in my work as an expert witness, but when I do training, is that HR, who are tasked with the investigations, have not been trained in how to do them. As a result, they can increase the liability of the company. When I do an investigation, of course, and I'm reviewing documents, I always ask for a copy of the investigative report and with all of the additional documents that should be included that were used in forming a decision. And what I find is that either there is no report, it's lackadaisical at best, and that the individual had not ever been trained in how to conduct an investigation. I think what happens is that employers often think that all HR professionals were taught that in college, number one, or have somehow learned it along the way. They have not. And then the other aspect of this is you have to be able to prove that the victim did not take reasonable action. And so that, of course, has been called the affirmative defense. So the affirmative defense is that the employer must exercise reasonable care to both prevent and correct harassing behavior. So if, for example, HR or management is aware of Johnny telling these dirty jokes periodically, and they know that, okay, yeah, he shouldn't be doing that, but, that's kind of Johnny, and then it gets to the point where Johnny's behavior has escalated to, we'll say, massaging Susie's neck and shoulders, calling her honey, asking her to go out and have a drink, ad nauseum, and now they see this as sexual harassment. They correct it by, we'll say, firing him. The point of the matter is they never prevented Johnny's behavior from escalating to sexual harassment in the first place. So while they may have corrected it by firing him, they didn't prevent it. The other aspect then of that affirmative defense down below is where the employee fails to use whatever measures exist by the employer. Now, gender harassment is a piece that can be confusing. Excuse me, I have to take a drink. So it is a form of hostile work environment behavior. You have to look at it within the environmental context, and it involves, where we will see it most frequently is where there is gender typing of the occupation, and there's a skewed male-female ratio in the gender composition of the work group. That may, in fact, really alter the organizational climate. One of the cases that I worked on actually involved lawyers. And, there's been two cases I've worked on that have been gender harassment. The first one I won't mention, but the second one, because you're all attorneys, I will mention. And in this case, it was going to be really a tough one to demonstrate, and they ended up settling early on. But the point is that we found that two of the women were, in fact, being treated much differently just based on the fact that they were women. They were not employed by a law firm. They were corporate attorneys that had responsibilities, and it was quite an interesting piece of it. Let's go ahead and take a break and see if any of you have any questions that you would like to. Let me just go. I should hit that next slide first. When we've got gender-based harassment, you can see on this slide that it's kind of like I mentioned, that it's a nexus of sexual harassment, bullying, and sex discrimination. They all sort of merge together. All right? So what questions do you have so far about sexual harassment?
Sure. If all the attendees can enter in the passcode for today, which is harassment, and any questions that you have for Susan. First question, can flirting, etc., be considered as a violation of the Professional Code of Responsibility, thus putting one's license in jeopardy?
I tell you, I think if flirting were, there'd be an awful lot of people that would be without their licensure. Flirting is flirting. Flirting, we're going to do a little piece of it in a little bit that compares the two, but flirting is dealing with human sexuality, and it's something that's built into who we are. When we talk about sexual harassment, we're really talking about an abuse of power. Flirting is generally looked at as reciprocal. There's reciprocity, and if one person flirts and the other one flirts back, there's nothing wrong with that. Now, if one person flirts and there is no positive regard to the intention of the quote-unquote flirting behavior, and you continue, now it is no longer flirting. Now you've escalated to it being sexual harassment very loosely, because from a psychological perspective. But if you continue to flirt when somebody clearly is not interested, or that's your main mode of communication as you're going around flirting with all the women, that is a whole other issue. issue. But we all flirt. We all flirt in the workplace now and again. And there's nothing wrong with some occasional innocent flirting. It would not have anything to do with putting your license in jeopardy.
And just a follow-up to that question, how do you know if it's not welcome?
Well, that's always a good question, right? Unwelcomeness is sometimes a difficult piece to determine. Certainly, there's the obvious signs. If somebody is flirting and you don't respond in kind, that's one sign. It may be that somebody walks away from you, or somebody says to you, oh, get a life. Or somebody says right out, listen, I'm not interested. Thank you for the invitation to go out to dinner or whatever, but I'm not interested. So sometimes it's very overt and you're told. Sometimes it's hard to read the body language. It might just be in the body language where somebody does not smile at you after you flirted. Somebody does not flirt back. But it can become difficult. One of the things that is encouraged is that if you are not wanting to engage in a reciprocal flirting, even during a small moment in time, whatever is, then at least don't act like you're enjoying it, because people will do that. People will act as though the flirting is okay or the comment that you made is okay because they don't want to be viewed as a prude. They don't want to be isolated from everyone else. So it's really a very good question. And the investigation will need to be able to show that, and that's assuming you've got a good investigator. I'll give you some other ideas as we go through, because men are saying frequently, oh, geez, how do I know if what I did was okay? So if you can bear with, I will be getting to some other aspects, but it's a good question because sometimes it's not always clear. You might be getting a double message.
And our last question for this section, can you talk about your experience with this subject matter, considering you are an RN?
Oh, yeah. Well, people will say, "Well, how did you ever get involved in this?" I maintain my nursing license because I do work with healthcare professionals around this topic. My master's degree is in public health, and I sort of see all of this as being, we're really talking about health. We're talking about employee health. We're talking about organizational health. So I see it all, still fitting in with my nursing. I still maintain my nursing license because I do work with healthcare providers, but I haven't done any clinical nursing for years and years and years. I've been in some management roles in healthcare, but that was also years and years and years ago. So my experience with the subject matter, it's too much to get into now, but it sort of evolved over the course of my career. It certainly was nothing that I learned in my education, that's for sure. So it's been self-taught.
Thanks, Susan. You can continue with the presentation.
Okay, so let me get back to the slides here. I think we're off a bit. We skipped a bunch. So we got to go way, way back. Okay, so here we are. So how do I get to slide 33? But somehow when we went to the Q&A, it jumped all the way to 33. I tried to hit it. I don't know. How do I do that? I was at 33 and I clicked it, but it didn't.
Yeah, we changed it back.
There it is. Okay, good. Now, one thing I want to mention is female-to-female bullying versus sexual harassment. I hear a lot about women who bully other women, and one of the things that could come up is it always bullying? I mean, could it be, in fact, sexual harassment? we've got women who are misogynistic just as much as men. And so is it really possibly gender-based harassment? Well, in order for the misconduct to be sexual harassment, it has to occur because of one's sex. So could one woman be targeting another woman because she is a woman? And when we look at the theories of oppression, for example, we see that that can fit under that theory. Would a woman sexually harass or bully, I should say, a man? They do, but not as often. Men have more power. So it's at an organization's peril if they do not conduct an investigation anytime there is a complaint of any bullying. This all came about during the Ontel versus Sundowner Supreme Court ruling when they talked about same-sex harassment being based on power and not being based on sexual attraction. And they even say something about female-to-female sexual harassment in there. So just be aware that that could be true. One of the things that people need to ask when observing behaviors, and this is true for HR, this is true for management, is any behavior, could it potentially be harassment? Is it possible that it could? And is the behavior potentially about stereotypes? Now, we've got two kinds of stereotypes, conscious and unconscious. Implicit is unconscious, and stereotypes are built into our DNA. It is something we've had since the beginning of time. And essentially, stereotypes, as the slide said, to stereotype is faster, and it was built in to protect us. But now what we're finding is, not so much. We may be having some problems with unconscious bias. And this is where we will see the piece that I talked about regarding intersectionality, where we've got stereotypes, and primarily what's been written in the research has dealt with black women. So it's the stereotype of black women along with harassment. And we will see it perpetuated then and referred to as intersection. It is the intersection of one's race with one's gender. Now, that could occur with other protected classes as well, but I've not read about it except dealing with black women. Now, I'm not sure if you all have heard of the implicit association test. What this test is it was developed by researchers at Harvard and I believe the University of Washington, and they developed a test that's been taken by 20 million people from 20 different countries. I'd encourage you to take it. It has been tested for validity and reliability, although I just finished working on a fascinating case, and we had a couple of expert witnesses on the implicit association test. Some were talking about the validity and reliability in a very positive mode, and of course the other was saying it was not particularly valid and reliable. It's a timed test, and it examines your stereotypes that are unconscious about various factions of society. Anything from body weight to skin color to you name it on the protected classes. I encourage you to take it. It's fascinating. And even those of us that work for social justice, those of us that believe in social justice, still have our unconscious biases. You'll be surprised at what you see. Now, sexual harassment behaviors generally fall into three primary categories. Certainly verbal is one of the most common. And it's, the jokes or profanity or saying, boy, do you fill out that sweater nicely, making comments about people's physical appearance. The nonverbal is licking your lips, having screensavers that aren't appropriate, the pornography, for example, and remembering that social media can be used this way. And then the physical can be anything from touching, patting, pinching, slapping, bagging. I don't know if you've ever heard of bagging, blocking somebody's passage, but it can be all the way up to sexual assault and rape. So while these sexual harassment insinuations and allegations by women that we've heard have included sexual assault and rape. And you think, well, wait a minute, isn't that a crime? Yeah, it is. But it is also a violation of Title VII. So you've got to, if somebody comes to the HR or management and they're talking about anything physical, you've got to make sure that you start taking that much more seriously, in my point of view, than verbal, although not necessarily. You know, it was interesting. I was at a social gathering about a month ago, and everybody there was highly educated. It included a physician who was an oncologist. It included some people that were in the C-suite of different corporations, etc. And I was amazed at how they did not understand sexual harassment. I couldn't believe it. And it was interesting because the oncologist, as an example, worked in a practice, and he was the only male, and the rest of the oncologists were female. And, of course, having a healthcare background, I'm always interested in that piece of it. But he said he'll come to work some days, and some of his female colleagues will say to him, "Oh, geez, I really like that suit," or, "Hey, I got a haircut, looking good today," or something, very innocently. He said, "I would never say that to them. I would be scared to death to say to one of my female colleagues, 'Hey, I like your hair, it's a nice new style,' or, 'Oh, boy, I really like your dress or suit,' or whatever." He said that would not be safe for me to do so. So when you're in a social gathering, it's like, oh, do I really want to get into this? But it taught me that men are still not clear about what they can and can't or should not say. It was an interesting evening. I've given you a list as a handout of behaviors which may, and as you look, it says may constitute harassment because it's in the eye of the beholder, etc. But I wanted you to have that as a handout to review. One of the pieces that comes up is sexual favoritism. And with that, it's interesting to note that if you've got a boss and that boss is showing preferential treatment towards one of his direct reports who is a female, that is not considered discriminatory. Now, this is fairly new because before that there was some who would say, hey, she gets more treatment than the rest of us, and they would say that that was sexual harassment. But what the court said is, while she may be getting preferential treatment, the fact is that the remainder of employees may not be getting it, but that included both the male and the female employees. Therefore, it was not considered sexual harassment. That was changed, though, when it's members of the same sex are getting preferential treatment. Do you remember when I talked about bullying? And if Johnny's a bully, but only to the women, that could potentially be gender-based harassment. Well, conversely, the opposite might be true. Maybe Johnny only treats the women in a more positive manner than the men. So then could the men be receiving gender-based harassment because they are not the sexual favorite? Now, there are third-party harassers, and I will show you just a couple of examples of them. Oh, it might be the pop machine vendor, for example. It could be anybody, and the third-party harasser is the individual who is not an employee. So with you all being attorneys, it could be your client or customer. It could be somebody who you are dealing with on an ongoing basis, and they are consistently making sexual comments to you. Now, this becomes a challenge. I know when I was a student nurse way back in the day, I had one of my patients grab me and pull me up into the bed with him. Now, I was only 18 years old, and nobody knew how to deal with it way back then, but that would be an example. I'll give you another example. This one happens to be a medical device company, And in this case, the sales rep was doing business. One of her primary clients was a surgeon, and this surgeon was one of the medical devices, one of the best customers. And as a result, they certainly did not want to come down heavy on this particular surgeon, but he was consistently sexually harassing the sales rep. She complained, and what the employer wanted to do was move her to a different client, a different surgeon, and that was going to be their way of taking care of the problem, only that would have diminished her commission. That would have been blatant retaliation. So they knew they needed to deal with the issue. So in this case, the CEO of the medical device company met with the surgeon because they wanted to maintain him, certainly as a customer. She wanted to maintain him as a client, and all ended up fine. But be careful of the retaliation. Social media, everything we're talking about today is true on social media as well. So make sure that you know that what your state's law is. But also, I hope you have a social media policy and procedure. And in that policy and procedure, make sure that you specifically address sexual harassment and how you would be dealing with that. Now, what about outside of work? Because sometimes the social media issues appear outside of work, where people might be sending a sexually explicit sexting message, for example. I'll give you an example. My daughter was employed by a certain company, and they went. All of the entire company was flown to another city for a 4-day conference. And they brought in speakers and yada, yada, yada. Well, the last day of the conference, I should say the last night of the conference where everyone was staying, they all had a couple of drinks, and you know how that goes. So everybody was going up to their hotel rooms, and one of the VPs was on the same floor as several of the other women's rooms. And when one of the women, the last woman, went to open her hotel room door, he pushed her in and sexually assaulted her. So that is an example of what is happening, and he got fired. So for all of us, there is a critical point as to where our comfort level is. And it's going to vary. Generally speaking, the less severe the behavior, such as a stare, the less likely you need to worry about it. The more severe, then anytime you're dealing with touch, for example, you have more of a problem. And of course, it's going to be based on people's perceptions. So men will be concerned. And what I hear from men is that they are not sure how to behave. So they wonder if they have ever crossed the line. They wonder if they have recognized what's been going on and not spoken up about it. And they are concerned. So these are some guidelines to determine if your behavior and your comments are harassment, and they make sense. One, would you behave that way if you knew that all of your behavior was going to go on in the newspaper, on TV, and in social media? Would you behave this way if your significant other was standing next to you? Everything from your partner to your wife to your sister to your child to your mother, what would you do? So would you behave that way if their significant other was standing next to them? Is there equal power between you and the person with whom you're interacting? That's a good one. And remember that even though we're talking about power, the power doesn't have to be formal power. It is informal power as well. Would you want someone that you were in a relationship with to be subjected to this kind of behavior? Probably not. And then here it gets back to the flirting. Is there equal initiation and participation between you and the person with whom you're interacting? So these are some guidelines. To me, they make just as much sense as they possibly can. Now, this gives you, and I have a typo I see, but this gives you an idea of harassment versus flirting. And this explains how the recipient of the behavior is going to feel based on the behavior directed towards her or him. And this is something you can look at later, and I apologize, under harassment, makes the receiver feel, and it says bad, angry, demeaned. I've got that down twice, so I apologize for that. And remember that all of this is in the eye of the beholder. One person might find something objectionable, another person may not, because it's based on our perceptions. So there's three faces here. Do you see all three faces? And we don't have time to get into it, but there's three of them. Now, granted, they're a little bit abstract, but people usually see two of them much more quickly than the third. So a little challenge for you. Now, when we look at the types of men that harass, research has shown there's kind of three overall types. The hardcore, the opportunist, and the insensitive. Let's look at them in a little bit more detail. The hardcore harasser seeks opportunity. This man is not as likely to stop, and they get off on sexually harassing women. They have an affinity towards it. I'm going to keep going here instead of stopping. The opportunist harasser is your more typical harasser. They don't seek the opportunity, but hey, when the opportunity presents itself, off they go. They will probably stop. Then we've got the insensitive harasser. They don't have a clue. They're totally unaware that what their behavior is objectionable, unprofessional, and unwelcome. They don't seek the opportunity, and when they're told to stop, they do. So those are just three general types. Now, there's other theories as to why men harass. You see them there on your slide. I'm not going to discuss them. I do want to say one thing about male bonding. When we see men sexually harassing women and there are other men present, and it's more of a group, what the research suggests is that men use the sexual harassment as a way to police gendered norms and a way to bond with other men. Okay? Terminology, let's talk about LGBT. And one thing I want to say about transgender is a transgender individual, that the word transgender is an adjective, not a noun. So you would say that somebody is a transgender woman or a transgender man. We would use the word trans as well. Transsexual is not an okay word to use. What we will see is LGBTQI. We're seeing the LGBT umbrella term being expanded to using Q for questioning, meaning people are questioning their sexual orientation and their gender identity, and queer, which has become a political, self-affirming term that the LGBT community is embracing. If, in fact, a straight person were to call an individual a queer, it would not be appropriate. But the LGBT community will use that among themselves. We will also see courses that are being taught at universities on queer studies. We will see the term used more in professional publications. Intersex is another interesting phenomenon. It is an incident where a baby is born with ambiguous external genitals. About 1 out of every 1,500 to 2,000 babies is born where the genitals are ambiguous. Now, this is something that may be challenged in the workplace. We are finding that people that were intersex years ago, but were assigned a sex by their parents based on a number of different criteria, which we don't, if you want to take another webinar, we get into that in more detail. But anyway, on a number of criteria, they're finding out as adults that they were born intersex, and they're not happy about it. So for the first time last summer, we had an adult female in the United States legally change her birth certificate from female to intersex. For the first time in Canada, we had a mother who did not assign a sex to her child at birth, the first time in the world, and wants the child to make that determination when the child is old enough to do so. We're going to be hearing more about this. I would recommend, if you're interested, about 2 years ago, there was an excellent documentary called The Gender Revolution. It was done on National Geographic. Katie Curry hosted it. I think you can get it on Netflix. And it explores both transgender and intersex individuals, looking at it from childhood and as an adult. A stands for ally, androgynous, or asexual. Gender nonconforming, I'll give you an example. One of the cases I worked on involved a young woman who identified as female, identified as a lesbian, but I'll tell you, in talking to her, I had to keep reminding myself she was a she. She appeared male in her mannerisms, her style of speech, and her style of dress. But she was a female. She was not a transgender individual. So you may see gender nonconforming. These people that do not conform to sexual stereotypes are allowed to dress any way that they want. You as an organization cannot tell them that they can't, even if you've got a customer or a client saying, I'm not going to do business with you anymore if you employ people like that. The LGBT is the umbrella term. Gender expression is how we express our maleness and femaleness. Gender identity is how we feel in our heart of hearts about being masculine or feminine. Now, granted, gender identity and our sexual expression usually are aligned. So the question is, what is sex and what is gender? The courts are probably going to have to make that determination because they're in arguments about it right now, whether or not civil rights, Title VII, back in 1964, when they talked about sex discrimination, did that include gender? Well, I graduated from high school in 64 and I went into nursing, and we never differentiated. Sex was sex, and it just wasn't. It was what you were. But now that's a whole other story. So stay tuned and watch the different courts and what they're deciding, because some courts are saying that the LGBT folks, federal courts included, are protected. Others are saying no. So, is the LGBT group protected? Well, EEOC says yes, they are. But, of course, the EEOC is not a court. Some EEOC says that all protected classes should be protected from associational discrimination, meaning, for example, and this came from the ADA, meaning that, in fact, if I was married to a transgender male, that my boss could not discriminate against me because of my association with a transgender male. Okay? Now, EEOC says this. Who knows if the courts will? Sex discrimination, this is the iffiness. Is the LGBT community protected under Title VII sex discrimination? Is gender the same as sex? And then sex stereotype. You cannot discriminate against somebody based on a sex stereotype. So therefore then, would we assume that LGBT population is protected? These are questions. The federal law has a pending bill, which I don't think we'll ever see go to fruition, called EMDA. That's attending. It won't even, we'll probably be dead if that ever gets to Congress and gets a debate. And then if you use any contractors, if any of your clients use contractors, the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs has not taken a stance on LGBT population harassment because the courts haven't. Now, one other new one that I have not added to the slide is the American Disabilities Act. We had two judges recently, federal judges, rule that transgender individuals are protected under the ADA. Why? Because they have a diagnosis of gender dysphoria. Now, it's my understanding that the federal judges made that determination, meaning then that the cases that they were forming the opinion on could go to court. So we'll see what happens there. There are 23 states, as well as Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico, that will protect lesbian, gay, and bisexual individuals. At least 200 cities do, but some of the states and some of the cities can vary a bit in scope. There are 19 states that protect transgender individuals. And a transgender individual is referred to somebody whose sex that was assigned to them at birth is not aligned with their gender identity. These people are exposed much more to isolation and discrimination in the workplace and in society, and as well to violence. And I know we're getting low on time. Believe it or not, these are some of the questions that defendants have asked transgender individuals. This you can go through, we'll keep going. Which bathroom to use? It is recommended that you let people use the bathroom that aligns with their gender. I know we've got a lot of questions, so I'm going to kind of go through quickly. This gives you examples of retaliation. This gives you what the EEOC refers to as tangible employment actions, which basically is retaliation. And retaliation then, again, retaliation is only illegal if it is occurring as a result of an individual coming forward with a complaint of discrimination and harassment. Now, you can have post-employment retaliation as well. And again, because of time, and I see we have a lot of questions, this gives you some ideas on what can happen after an individual leaves the employment. I've given you some examples here of the impact of harassment. Please note over on the left, it has on the target and witnesses. Yes, the witnesses, because of something in our brain called mirror neurons. This is the same portion of our brain that gives us empathy. So if you've got one sexual harasser in a department or a work unit and everybody else sees it occurring, hears about it, those witnesses can be impacted by it almost to the same degree as the target. So you've got a number of victims. All right, now the Anita Hill, Clarence Thomas, some of you may remember that, I do, 1991, one of the senators referred to Anita Hill as a little bit nutty and a little bit slutty, and then we wonder why people don't come forward to complain. This is a handout that tells you why. And of course, all of this is due to the abuse of power. And we've got certain industries that have more abuse of power than others, which are demonstrated here on the slide. Be sure with your training that you train all of these groups. Managers need their own specific training. Investigators must have training on how to investigate. This is important. You've got to change the culture, not looking at merely checking the box. Are your victims and employees going to believe that, hey, you take this stuff seriously? Or do they think that you're merely doing the training just to check the box? These are some of the training challenges. Please be aware that when you have young workers, sexual harassment in K through 12 and post-secondary is very often the norm. So when they come to work, they may not know, hey, you can't do that stuff here. Do not use, do not use online training, not this kind, but like DVD types of training. This is what you need to look at for training purposes. Be sure that you train your temporary workers. I give a trigger warning before I train, recognizing that there are some people in the group that will have a history of abuse, and I want them to feel like they can get up and walk out if they need to. Be aware that a supervisor can be beyond just a supervisor. If there's somebody that an employee believes has power and authority to change your work, that may be considered a supervisor by some courts. Don't. Consensual relationships, just don't do it if you're in a reporting mechanism. What do you do if it happens to you? This is what you do. You document all of this using those bullet points. And if it's happening, let's say that you've got Johnny that's massaging Susie's neck and shoulders, calling her honey, and asking her to have a drink, what Susie can say is, Johnny, I don't want you touching me. I don't want you calling me honey. I don't want you asking me out for a drink. Now that's very observable, objective language, and it uses I statements. And if Johnny says to Susie, oh, for crying out loud, don't be such a prude, then Susie repeats it. That's the broken record. Johnny, I told you, I don't want you touching me. I don't want you calling me honey. I don't want you asking me out for a drink. And if you do, I'm going to report you. All right? This tells you what a complaint is. The only piece that's missing is anonymous. You will get anonymous complaints. This gives you information on how to receive a complaint. This tells you why to investigate. Again, because of time, I'm not going to get into all of it. This talks about prevention. And I think it's important that you either look at it from this point of view for your law firm or with your clients. And this just gets into it, looking at the company through a gendered lens, using teachable moments. And how are you going to make sure new employees know what's going on? Be sure your policies include examples of gender-based sexual harassment. I think this is important, where you ask, have we tolerated the misconduct? Is there an employee that we sort of let go on this thing? This gives you management's responsibility. You have to be aware that this is what you need to do as a manager, and that's kind of it. I've given you another handout, but I want to be able to get some questions, and so I've got to leave some time on that. So, yes, what questions do we have?
Thanks, Susan. If all the attendees can enter in the passcode for today, which is harassment. Also, if we're, since the time is coming short, we will be sending all of your questions that we do not get to today over to Susan to answer them directly to you. And just to remember that if you are applying for CLE credit, you must be logged on for the full 90 minutes of the presentation. The first question is, does the definition or meaning of harassment change for foreign-owned companies operating in the USA or for U.S. companies operating in foreign jurisdictions?
If, in fact, you've got sexual harassment occurring in another company, in like a satellite office in Ireland or wherever, then the U.S. law will apply to those employees. Yes. I would check with your attorney on that, but you still are obligated to follow U.S. law within the employment in another country.
Next question. Is the use of specific generic terms such as sweetie or dear regarded as harassment or other form of inappropriate or actionable offense?
You know, I missed the two terms. It didn't come through. It didn't come through very clear.
Is the use of specific generic terms such as sweetie or dear regarded as harassment or other form of inappropriate or actionable offense?
Yes, it is. Now again, it might be more of a psychological harassment than illegal. Remember, the factors to make it illegal is it has to be severe and or pervasive enough to interfere with the individual's ability to do their job based on a reasonable woman or reasonable person. So it can be, yes. Very often if somebody doesn't like it, it's more a matter of, depending upon the frequency, of course, and the pervasiveness, it's more a matter of it being a violation of the policy or psychological harassment than illegal harassment. And I get asked that sometimes. I know me, for example, I call my friends honey quite a bit. Sometimes even when I used to work inside, I'd say, hey, honey, let's go have lunch. And these were all women, and I knew them very well. I probably wouldn't do that now if I worked inside, but it's just, it could be psychological harassment or it could be a violation of policy. Those two are kind of the same. But if it's not severe, which the terms are not, but if it's not pervasive, then it would not be actionable.
Next question. Can an underlined harass his or her supervisor?
Oh, absolutely. I hear about it all the time. That's why I'm saying you can be a direct report, and people have power, different ways of having power. And we hear that even though the supervisor may be the individual with power, it doesn't mean that there aren't those that have indirect power that report to him or her. And think about it. You've got informal leaders all over in your law firm. You've got them with your clients, and those informal leaders can just be nasty to the supervisor, and it can be sexual harassment or racial or any number of other protected class harassment. But yes, they absolutely can, no question about it.
Next question. Does negative comments about employees' advanced age constitute a form of sexual harassment?
Okay, for some reason could you say that one more time, please? Okay, does negative comments about something, employees' advanced age? Well, first of all, if you're making comments about age, it's about age harassment, not sexual harassment. So that would, if I'm reading it correctly, negative comments dealing about age is age harassment. But if it's dealing about sex and age, then that could be an intersection of age and sex. So it could potentially then be sexual harassment, depending upon what those comments are. And again, you'd have to determine, is it actionable based on the criteria of Title VII, or are we talking about behaviors that are more psychologically harassment and against the policy harassment rather than rising to the level of being illegal?
Last question. How do you handle a person who is hypersensitive in regard to their sexual identity in the workplace? If their claims of being harassed are deemed unreasonable, how do you resolve between them and their coworkers and employer?
Okay, read the first part to me, if you would, please, again. Or if you, okay.
How do you
handle first
handle
part in regard to their sexual? Okay, first of all, what do you mean by hypersensitive in regard to their sexual identity? So I'm assuming you're talking about somebody who must fall into the LGBT population. So you want to be careful about assuming that they're hypersensitive. Remember, they're in the minority, and they're probably going to be picking up on a number of different nonverbal cues that they would see that a straight person would not see. We know that that happens. One of the ways that you can deal with this as an organization is you should have an employee resource group that is comprised of those that are within the LGBT community. Part of my concern is when you say hypersensitive, not that all of us don't have some hypersensitivity about certain issues, but I think when we look at sexual identity, those folks have been discriminated against and isolated and stuff so frequently that they may in fact see some of those nuanced types of behaviors that those of us that are straight would not see. So I would try to get rid of thinking that they're hypersensitive. Instead, and I don't know the particulars, so I'm really being very generic in my response to you, for you, it might, whoever you is, you or HR, whomever, they may see the complaints as being unreasonable. And in fact, they may not be. I don't know, because I don't know the specifics. But it sounds to me like what you need to do here is a huge amount of prevention. What do your policies say? Are your policies LGBT inclusive? There's such a thing as a lavender ceiling, just as there is a glass ceiling. Have all employees been trained about what it means to be LGBT? What are some of the types of discriminatory and harassing behaviors that people that are LGBT in the workplace are confronted with daily that straight people may not even be aware of? So I would examine your culture within your work environment, and number one. Number two, I would get as many LGBT people as you can, and there may only be one, to examine your policies. Number three, I would make sure that you do training of sexual harassment, but I would make sure that you really get into doing some training on the LGBT population, what it means to be working in an environment where people can freely talk about, oh, my spouse this and my children this, and whatever, and yet many times LGBT people feel like they have to keep that part of them a secret. They're sometimes referred to as an invisible minority because they don't feel that it is safe to speak out. So I would, whoever is asking this, all of you really, I would try to do as much reading as you can about the issues regarding LGBT folks in the workplace. But I think you're examining your culture, looking at your policies, and doing some really good training.